June 5, 1942. North Pacific Ocean. Morning on the flagship Yamato, roughly 300 miles west of Midway Atoll. The sea was a slow gray, the sky a pale lid, and the ship's great hull shivered as wireless traffic rose and fell inside the steel like anxious breath. Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome stood on the starboard side of the bridge and pressed field glasses to his eyes until the metal rings hurt his brow. He could not see the carriers that mattered. He could not see Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, or Hiryu. He saw only low clouds, white seams on the horizon, the faint exhale of spray off the bow, and the wake that looked like chalk smeared across slate. A petty officer brought the last decoded signals. The words were plain and heavy, one carrier burning fiercely, another lost. Then another. Then Hiryu alone, still fighting. Ugaki felt a slow drifting inside his chest, as if the ship had turned, although the helmsman had not moved the wheel. He had watched vessels sink before. He had read casualty lists. He had written orders that sent men into harm's way. Yet this felt different. The loss came not as a sudden blow, but as a long slide, like earth giving way under a hillside house until the foundations sagged and cracked and the walls sighed. He walked to the voice tubes, asked again for positions, ranges, fuel states of accompanying cruisers and destroyers, and the state of the main body's air search. He spoke softly, almost like a man talking to himself. Below, in the flag plot, men bent over charts marked with grease pencil. Behind him, Admiral Yamato stood silent, hands behind his back, eyes flat and watchful. No one raised a voice. Somewhere aft, a boatswain's whistle rose and fell. On the bridge, a junior officer crossed himself so quickly it looked like he brushed dust from his jacket. Ugaki's diary would record the day with fewer words than the weight it left on his heart. But in that hour, his senses took in everything: the smell of oil and coffee, the braid on a sleeve bent into a crease that would never press out, the taste of cold air that stung the tongue, and a thought that came and would not leave. If 3 carriers were gone and the 4th crippled, then the center of the fleet had been struck from the board. If the center was gone, what remained would have to pretend it was still there, while the enemy did not need to pretend anything at all. Across the ocean on that same day, the broader map was changing shape with an authority that no one ship's company could fully see. In 6 hours of combat near Midway Atoll, United States Navy aircraft from Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet put bombs through decks that Japanese crews had just packed with fueled aircraft and a live ordnance. Fires rose that even the most disciplined damage control parties could not defeat. 3 fleet carriers that had formed the point of the spear across the Pacific were lost before noon. The 4th, Hiryu, launched 2 courageous strikes that crippled Yorktown, and then herself fell under a wave of dive bombers that came out of the sun. In the space of a day, Japan lost the core of the 1st Air Fleet. The numbers would be written down in Tokyo as the weeks passed. 4 carriers gone, around 300 aircraft gone, hundreds of trained aircrew gone, many of them irreplaceable men who had learned their craft over years of hard experience in China and in the long outward march across the Pacific. The United States lost 1 carrier and around 150 aircraft. It could replace ships and planes at a pace that industry was already proving. Japan had built 6 fleet carriers in a decade. America was laying down dozens of new hulls in a single year. Large fleet carriers and smaller escort carriers, with entire air groups trained to fill them. In the months after Midway, The first of the Essex-class carriers would slide down the ways, and by late 1943, the United States Navy would have more flight decks at sea than any navy had ever commanded. Even on June 5, 1942, before these numbers reached the staff rooms, the shape of that future was visible to any admiral who could read steel and oil the way a farmer reads weather. Ugaki had always believed that the decisive battle would come when the combined fleet chose it, in waters and at a time suited to its doctrine. Now he understood that the enemy could enforce its own timetable because it could absorb loss and still come on. A single day's results contained a decade's warning. The pain was not just the carriers, it was the pilots. Japan's aviators had been trained in small cohorts that prized individual skill. The training pipeline was long and exacting. The United States was already graduating hundreds of pilots each month, feeding them into carriers and island bases across a widening map. Ugaki had heard Yamato say many times that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, and then would face an enemy who would gather and then move with a power that no courage could stop. In a private letter before the war, Yamato had warned that he would win early victories and then expect no success at all. On the morning after Midway, the warning felt less like prediction and more like a fact written into the ocean itself. He went below to the flag spaces, sat at a small desk where the edges had been worn smooth by elbows and charts, and began to write notes so that the dispatches would be exact. He wrote in his diary as well, the private words that no one would see for years. He wrote that the day had brought grief and that grief sat not like a wound, but like a shadow that would now follow every future plan. He wrote that he could not shake the sense that the enemy had found a way to be present everywhere while he himself felt confined to lane lines painted across a pool. He checked figures on fuel and ammunition for the main body and for the Aleutians diversion group, noted what heavy cruisers still had their scouting planes, calculated the radius of a renewed search if ordered. Then he set his pencil down and closed his eyes and saw another map. It did not show tiny islands and compass roses. It showed resources and time. It showed oil in numbers that could be moved and burned. It showed pilots and how long it took to make them. It showed shipyards and the number of keels laid on a given month. This map was cruelly simple. Japan had taken oil from the Dutch East Indies, but could not bring it all home because submarines stalked tankers along routes that were long and vulnerable. Japan could not replace pilots at the rate at which the war was now spending them. Japan could not match American yard output. On paper, a decisive battle doctrine assumed that you gave such a battle when you had superiority of force. In truth, that day had already passed. The next battles would be fought to slow the enemy's material tide and to preserve the fleet until some better position could be held. The pity was that the Pacific offered few strong hands. Airfields could be built on coral and built quickly. Once the enemy had a chain of fields, they could leap forward one more link and bring the next island under bombardment until another field was ready. Ugaki opened his eyes and listened to the ship. Yamato thrummed with power. Her guns could throw shells across 20 miles. Her armor could shrug off blows that would wreck lighter ships. Yet he felt what could not be said aloud on that day. A ship without friendly carriers over her was a target, and the carriers now gone could not be magicked back from the sea. The next hours passed in a workman's rhythm. Signals drafted and sent, dispatches read and filed, short conferences with the Admiral, a man who did not explain feelings to subordinates, but who did not need to. Yamamoto's face held the same reserve it always had. Yet he spoke more quietly, and even his silences sounded different. He had known risk when he proposed the operation. He had wanted to draw the enemy out and kill their carriers near Midway so that the broader Pacific map would tilt back in Japan's favor. Now, with the news in hand, Uganda could not help but remember the private sentence that had circulated in staff rooms and among the men who had known Yamamoto when he served in the United States. In the first 6 months to a year, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. After that, I have no expectation of success. It was not a boast. It was a warning about industrial war. The staff on Yamato did not speak the sentence aloud, but it hung in the air like the taste of cordite after the guns stop. Beyond the flagship, the ocean spread out indifferent to men's plans. Flying fish broke water and flashed. Low swells rolled and rolled again. Somewhere far ahead on the flat line of the horizon, a destroyer's bow wave threw a white V that looked like chalk on a slate. Ugaki looked down at his own hands and saw a tremor he did not show to others. He had never been afraid of death at sea. He had feared only the failure of duty. Now he feared a different thing. He feared that duty itself, done with perfect precision, might no longer be able to change outcomes. He did not yet know the names of the aviators who had climbed into dauntless dive bombers that morning. He would not remember all the American squadron numbers. He did not need to. He understood that the enemy was not a few pilots in a few planes. The enemy was a nation that could pour out pilots and planes until the sky seemed to build new flocks every month. He closed the diary, returned to the plotting table, and moved a small wooden block that marked a task force position. The block was light. It slid easily. The carriers it represented were not light. They were gone. The feeling that remained was heavy and would last. By the time the combined fleet withdrew from the waters near Midway and set course for safer seas, the wider world had already begun to reckon with what had happened. Analysts in Washington looked at loss figures and saw not only a battle won, but a hinge in time. Japanese staff officers on other ships, men who had not seen the fires with their own eyes, still understood from the signals that a door had shut. In Tokyo, senior officers framed the disaster as a temporary misfortune. They prepared statements that noted the enemy's luck and praised the courage of the air groups that had fought under terrible odds. They wrote of rebuilding and of the spirit of the fleet. None of that was false. Japanese sailors were brave. Japanese shipyards would work hard. But the numbers had their own truth. Enterprise of the United States Navy would sail again and again. Yorktown would be replaced by new carriers as soon as docks and cranes could complete them. Hornet would be joined by sister ships whose names were already painted on hulls under scaffolds. In the next year, more American carriers would be commissioned than Japan had even planned before the war began. Ugaki could not see those docks. He could not watch the cranes dipping and lifting, the rivet guns flashing, the long lines of workers leaving factories at dusk with lunch pails empty and faces set. Yet he could imagine them because he had lived in a culture that measured national power in savings of steel and stores of rice, and he had read the reports that spoke of American factories that could fill whole counties. He had read that a single yard might have more cranes than an entire naval district in Japan could hope to muster. He had walked through American cities before the war and had seen streets full of automobiles. He had seen the lights of buildings burn long after midnight. Now memory sharpened, and the picture it made did not favor him. In the days after the battle, as the fleet threaded homeward through wide water, Ugaki wrote more in his diary than he usually allowed himself. He wrote about the men he had met on Akagi's flight deck, who would never again joke in the ready. room or fidget with flight gloves as a deckhandler's flags began to wave. He wrote of a young observer who had once told him that an aircraft carrier was like a town that moved, a floating neighborhood with its own smells and its own sounds. You could close your eyes and know you were on a carrier by the whine of the arresting cables and the rhythm of the engines under your feet. That town had burned and then sunk into a blue grave. He wrote of responsibility. In the Navy of his youth, a captain was taught that he owned everything that happened on his ship, even if fate or weather helped. Now the scale of events had grown so large that a man could do everything right on a given day and still lose something that could not be replaced in a year or in two. He did not try to excuse errors in planning. He noted them for what they were. Dispersed forces. A plan that tried to do too many things at once. A lack of consolidated scouting. He wrote that he respected the enemy's courage as well as his material wealth. Torpedo squadrons had flown into slaughter. Dive bombers had pressed attacks through flak and through fighter defenses. Whether the final bombs dropped were lucky, or the product of skill did not change the truth that these men had flown when flying meant a very good chance of death. In a war of nations, courage would not be enough. Courage mattered only if it rode on a stream of fuel and steel that could flow day after day. The United States had that stream. Japan tried to create it by conquest, but the sea between the conquered wells and the home islands was long and full of hunters. Submarines would take tolls that no escort line could fully suppress. For a staff officer who loved figures, every wake on the chart began to look like an equation, and every equation ended with the same result. When the fleet reached home waters and reports spread across desks in Tokyo, committees formed to study causes and assign lessons. Ugaki sat through sessions where men spoke in calm voices and used words that were clean and light, words that graded the size of mistakes and the height of waves and the chance that smoke had screened a deck at the wrong moment. He kept his face still because that was what men in uniform did when elders spoke. He kept his voice low and plain when it was his turn. But inside he felt an unease that had nothing to do with pride or blame. He feared that the study of details would hide the loudest lesson. A modern carrier war favored the side that could afford to be struck and still throw fresh power into the next day. Japanese planning before the war had assumed a quick war of decision, a sword fight won by superior skill. The war that had now arrived was a mill that ground without haste, fed by trains and cranes and long rows of machines. When he returned to his quarters, he looked again at his notes on American capacity. A single plant in California could deliver aircraft by the hundreds each month. Engines poured from factories in the Midwest. Pilots trained in Texas and Florida and then went west to fight. The curve of production in every category did not rise in a line. It rose in a steep climb. Japan could not match that curve. The best it could do was choose where to bleed. He did not yet know that within months the name Guadalcanal would enter his diary like a wound that reopened each day. He did not yet know the pound-for-pound cost of sending destroyers down a slot in black water to land drums that would roll into the sea. He did not yet know how it felt to see veterans replaced by boys who had sat in classrooms while their seniors fell into the ocean and never came up. But in the quiet of that room, he sensed that the line between war and arithmetic had thinned to nothing. He met Yamato again in a small office that looked out over water that sloshed against pilings with a sound like wind in paper. The Admiral's eyes were red at the corners. Ugaki knew the older man did not sleep well even in calm times. They spoke in the plain language of professionals who share the same burden. The Admiral did not ask for reassurances. He asked for what mattered. How quickly could air groups be rebuilt? Which carriers could be repaired or converted most quickly? What escorts would be needed to protect any operation that moved into dangerous water? He asked for the state of pilot training and whether instructors could be spared for frontline duty or if that would only rob the future to patch the present. Ugaki answered with what he knew. He did not disguise the thinness of the numbers. They spoke of hunters whose names had become familiar. American submarines that slipped close to shipping lanes and then slipped away again, leaving plumes of oil and a few bobbing boards. They spoke of oil storage and of the need to guard the fuel that fed the fleet. They spoke of time and of what could be done in it. After the meeting, Yamamoto stood and looked out the window, and for a long moment, the only sound was water on wood. Then he said that Japan must win quickly, where it could, because the clock would not stop. He did not tell men often that his heart lay with the Navy even as he served the state. He did not need to. Everyone knew. Ugaki saluted and left the room with a paper bundle that felt too light for the decisions it would guide. On a humid night not long after, Ugaki returned to his diary and wrote a few lines he would later edit into something more spare. He wrote that in the battle off Midway he had felt a door close. He wrote that the Navy still had brave ships and brave men, and that courage was not a trivial thing. But he also wrote that courage is most useful when it is not asked to do the work of a factory. He remembered a scene from years before, when he had toured a steelworks in the home islands and watched white heat push at the walls while ingots moved like bright loaves along rollers. The size of that place had impressed him then. Now it felt small in tone. His mind, as he compared it to the pictures he had seen of American works beside Great Lakes, where ore came in by the train and by the ship and left as rails and armor plate and engines by the thousands. He put the diary aside and reached for charts that mapped the South Pacific. He traced with a finger the arc from Truk to Rabaul to the Solomons. He understood that the enemy would come there. He understood that his own ships would go to meet them. He hoped for tactical success. He expected the price to be high. He went to sleep as dawn began to show, as a lightning smear beyond the shutters. He slept hard and woke quickly, as sailors do, and set to work again. August 7th, 1942. Truk Lagoon, the naval anchorage that was called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The air smelled of fuel and salt, and in the early light, the great body of the battleship Yamato reflected faint orange streaks from the east. Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome stood again on the flag bridge, looking over a harbor filled with cruisers, destroyers, oilers, and submarines lying still under a humid sky. The mood was different now. A few months earlier, the fleet had returned from Midway in a silence heavier than any storm. Now the reports on his desk spoke of American landings in the Solomon Islands. Marines had come ashore at Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Ugaki's hands rested on the rail as he listened to engines warming up and the hiss of air compressors from a nearby destroyer. He had read the first dispatches from the area and felt the same chill he had known on that morning in June when carrier decks burned. The enemy had moved with confidence, landing entire divisions on ground Japan had not fortified. The Japanese staff had expected that the outer defensive ring would give warning, that it would take months for Americans to mount such an operation. It had taken them only days after securing bases in the South Pacific. He turned to a signal officer who had just arrived with new traffic. The Americans had brought carriers, cruisers, transports, and a large covering force. Ugaki knew what that meant. They were not testing. They were beginning. The decisive battle that Japanese doctrine demanded had already been fought and lost at Midway, but few had said so openly. Now a new phase had begun, one that would drain the empire's lifeblood far from home, one island at a time. At the same hour, hundreds of miles to the south, the naval battle that would open the long campaign for Guadalcanal began. Japanese cruisers under Vice Admiral Mikawa Gunichi sped down what the Americans would call Iron Bottom Sound. They struck at night and struck hard, sinking 4 Allied cruisers in minutes. It was a brilliant action by night-trained sailors, and it restored some pride to a fleet that had bled heavily 2 months before. But even as telegrams of congratulations passed through Truk's offices, Ugaki understood what had not changed. Mikawa had withdrawn before dawn rather than risk his ships to carrier aircraft. The transports carrying food and supplies for the garrison on Guadalcanal had not been touched, and the Americans dug in. Ugaki marked figures in the margin of his notebook. Japan had lost more aircraft at Midway than its training schools could replace in 6 months. Its merchant fleet was already stretched thin, carrying oil from Borneo and Sumatra to refineries in the home islands. Submarines prowled those routes. Every convoy that left the Dutch East Indies was a gamble. Ugaki read the fuel reports and felt the squeeze tightening like a hand closing around a wrist. He thought of Yamamoto's words that Japan must win quickly, and he could see that quickness was no longer possible. It would now be a matter of holding, patching, improvising, and hoping that the enemy tired. But the enemy did not tire. From Pearl Harbor to Noumea, from the West Coast to the Coral Sea, America was learning to fight an industrial war that did not pause to breathe. Ugaki visited the flight schools on Truk and on Saipan later that month. He saw young men, barely out of their teens, practicing landings on narrow strips. The instructors, survivors from Coral Sea and Midway, carried themselves with the quiet melancholy of men who knew what they were sending their pupils into. He watched as mechanics stripped engines for parts that would not arrive for weeks. He listened to lectures on fuel management, dive angles, and torpedo settings, and he knew that many of these boys would soon be dead. He remembered the quality of the pilots who had been lost, men who had flown over China since 1937, who had learned to find targets by instinct. Those veterans were gone, and Japan was building a new air arm from fragments. The Americans, meanwhile, were training thousands every month, each one passing through standard programs, simulators, and schools that could be duplicated across an entire continent. Ugaki noted that the Navy had begun drafting students straight from high schools. It reminded him of the exhaustion that had overcome Germany in the last years of the Great War, when teenagers filled uniforms once worn by veterans. He spoke with the base commander, who admitted that fuel shortages limited training flights. Some days they could not fly at all. "We will save what remains for combat," the man said. Ugaki nodded, but did not answer. He knew that combat would waste it faster than any training could. In his diary, he wrote that the fleet's spirit was high, but the numbers did not lie. They could not replace machines. They could not replace men. And they could not replace time. By early September, the orders came to send reinforcements to Guadalcanal. The first transports sailed under cover of darkness. Ugaki watched them leave, lines of ships slipping past the reef and into open sea. He had the sense of watching lifeblood drain from a body that still walked upright. Every ship carried rice, ammunition, and men who would soon be isolated on a patch of jungle, far from help. He sent signals of encouragement and formal words of pride. But his private notes told another story. "The enemy grows stronger daily," he wrote. "Their planes are many, their ships are many. We must fight with the strength of one arm against two." The pattern that would define the rest of the Pacific War was already clear. Japanese victories would be brilliant but short. American counterstrikes would be heavier, and each would be supported by factories that ran without pause. By the time Yamato ordered new operations for the Solomon Islands, Ugaki no longer believed in victory. He believed only in endurance. Each report from the south came with the same message: pilots lost, destroyers sunk, oilers running low. The empire's perimeter, once drawn boldly across maps from Burma to Wake, was contracting. Truk still glimmered at night with ship lights and lanterns, but Ugaki saw what others did not. Beneath that surface hum lay a machinery of fatigue, a quiet acknowledgement among officers that Japan had entered a war it could not sustain. He looked again across the lagoon at the mass of Yamato. Her guns pointed toward a horizon that no longer promised triumph. Her very size now seemed a question rather than an answer. He closed his notebook and wrote a single line: "The tide that rose at Pearl Harbor has begun to fall." October 15th, 1942. Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. The sun rose behind thick clouds, painting the anchorage in dull pewter. Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome stood on the pier as cargo nets swung overhead, loading crates of ammunition onto a destroyer bound for Guadalcanal. He could feel the tension in the air, the kind that comes when men know they are feeding a battle that drains faster than it can be supplied. The soldiers on the pier smoked in silence, their uniforms stained with oil and sweat. Some of them were replacements, fresh from the home islands, and they still carried the quiet pride of men who had grown up hearing about early victories at Pearl Harbor, Java, and the Philippines. They didn't yet understand that the war had changed. Ugaki did. He had watched the numbers tighten around Japan like a noose since Midway. The reports he now carried from staff officers at Truk told a clear story. Fuel reserves were down to barely 6 months of wartime consumption. Tankers from the East Indies had been sunk by American submarines at a rate that stunned even the most optimistic planners. Every ton of oil that reached Rabaul had cost blood to bring here. He watched a young lieutenant standing by a gun mount on the destroyer and wondered how long that man would last once the ship entered Iron Bottom Sound. Few came back twice from those night battles. The broader picture across the Pacific in late 1942 was grimly precise. Japan's army still held Burma and most of the Dutch East Indies, but its ability to project power was shrinking. American forces on Guadalcanal had built an airfield, Henderson Field, and used it to control the skies by day. Japanese destroyers, running supply missions at night, called it the Tokyo Express, but those runs could never deliver enough. Every convoy lost a few ships. Every night mission cost fuel and men. American radar, a technology Japan barely understood, turned darkness into daylight. Ugaki read intelligence summaries describing how U.S. factories had produced 48,000 aircraft that year alone. Japan had built barely 8,000, and only a fraction could match the performance of the new American fighters appearing over the Solomons. The United States had already launched 17 new aircraft carriers since the year began, part of a production line that seemed endless. Ugaki's hand shook slightly when he wrote those numbers in his notebook. The handwriting slanted downward, the ink pooling in tiny dots where the ship beneath him swayed. He had been trained to think in terms of ships, squadrons, and divisions, Now the war was measured in assembly lines, kilowatts, and oil barrels. And in all those measurements, Japan was falling behind. Ugaki spent the following days visiting the field commands at Rabaul, meeting with air officers and logistics chiefs. The airbase reeked of fuel and cordite, the runways pitted by rain and patched by local laborers. He stood beside a wrecked Zero fighter that had been hauled in from the jungle. The pilot had bailed out and been captured by Australian troops. "He was a good man," a mechanic said quietly. "He had no fuel left to climb." The phrase stayed with Ugaki all day. No fuel left to climb. That was the Empire's condition now. Japanese aircraft at Rabaul often flew with only partial fuel loads because the tanks arriving from Truk were not enough. Crews worked through the night to keep old engines running. He saw men using spare parts scavenged from wrecks. He listened to pilots complain that their radios failed mid-combat. It was not lack of courage that hurt them. It was arithmetic. He sent a coded report to Yamato detailing shortages and suggesting that the fleet could no longer sustain simultaneous operations in the Solomons and the Aleutians. The reply, when it came, was characteristically brief. "Endure. Hold ground until spring." Ugaki read the words and understood what they really meant. There was no alternative. Retreat was politically impossible. Victory was materially impossible. So they would fight in place, bleeding and waiting for time to finish the work the enemy's bombs had begun. On November 13, 1942, news reached Rabaul of the disaster in Iron Bottom Sound. The battleships Hiei and Hiroshima were lost, along with cruisers and destroyers. Hundreds of men had gone down with their ships. Ugaki read the battle report twice in silence. American naval gunfire had been relentless, supported by radar-directed salvos that found targets before Japanese lookouts even sighted the enemy. "We fought blind against eyes that see in darkness," one surviving officer told him. The phrase captured everything the war had become. The Americans saw farther, flew higher, built faster. Japan was still fighting with the doctrine of Tsushima, expecting spirit to compensate for steel. Ugaki wrote in his diary that night, "The fleet bleeds from every seam. Each loss is a stone pulled from the foundation. We can fight, but cannot recover." He knew Yamato would press on, because surrender was unthinkable, but he also knew that the pattern was now irreversible. Japan's navy had begun the war as the most experienced in the world. It was now losing not because it lacked bravery, but because it was trapped by the physics of distance and supply. The empire had reached too far. Every mile gained in 1941 now demanded a ton of fuel to defend in 1942. And the Americans had more tons than the world had ever seen. By the end of the year, Rabaul itself had become a symbol of the empire's overreach. Once the hub of expansion, it now sat under a constant shadow of American reconnaissance aircraft. Ugaki would stand on the veranda of the command post and watch the sky, counting the contrails high above. "They fly as if the sky belongs to them," he wrote. The air raids came more often, sometimes at night, shaking the ground and splintering the wooden huts. Crews slept in trenches, civilians hid in caves. Ugaki kept a small map pinned to his wall marking each island still under Japanese control. Each month, more red flags disappeared. He stared at the map one evening and traced the line from Guadalcanal northward to the home islands. The distance looked enormous. He thought of the men who had died in those waters, thousands already, with tens of thousands more to come. He thought of the families in Japan who still believed the empire was advancing. And he thought of the truth, which he could not write in any official report. Japan had already lost the war of production, the war of supply, and the war of time. The only thing left was the war of endurance, and that would grind the nation to dust. He closed his notebook and wrote the same sentence twice so it could not be missed. The sun sets on Rabaul. We have not been defeated in one battle but in 100 small reckonings that no courage can repair. February 17th, 1943. Rabaul. The harbor was quiet at dawn, its waters thick with oil film and ash from the night's bombing. Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome walked along the narrow pier with his cap in hand, passing men repairing a hole torn in the pier's planks by a near miss. He had grown thinner that winter, his uniform hanging looser at the collar. The reports in his briefcase were worse than any he had carried before. Guadalcanal was lost. The evacuation, called Operation K, had succeeded in saving 12,000 men, but it was an admission of defeat the Navy dared not speak aloud. The proud imperial banners that had flown over the island for 6 months had been hauled down. Ugaki had reviewed the shown dispatches himself. Out of 30,000 soldiers sent to Guadalcanal, more than half were dead from battle, hunger, or disease. Thousands more were missing. The destroyers that brought the survivors back to Rabaul carried men so skeletal that medics thought some were dead. He had walked through the field hospital that week and seen soldiers too weak to raise their heads. The sight had chilled him more than any air raid. These were not the faces of men temporarily beaten. They were the faces of an empire bleeding to death in silence. In Tokyo, official bulletins called Guadalcanal a strategic withdrawal. In the inner rooms of the naval staff, the meaning was clearer. It was the first major land loss since the war began, and it marked the end of expansion. From now on, Japan would fight to hold what it had already taken. Ugaki understood what that meant for the fleet. The carriers that survived Midway were still under repair. The new carrier Tai-Ho was being built at Kure, but she would not be ready for more than a year. Meanwhile, the Americans had launched the Essex and the Independence classes, ships built in such numbers that Japan's intelligence officers had stopped trying to count them. Yamato had warned of this before the war, calling it the arithmetic of steel. Now that arithmetic had turned fatal, American shipyards launched new vessels every month. Japan launched one every few seasons. The airfields that once gave Japan control of the South Pacific were being erased one by one under Allied bombing. Ugaki received reports of daily raids against Lai, Salamaua, and Rabaul itself. The bombers came in formations so large that the sky looked like it had been cut into squares of aluminum. Japanese fighters rose to meet them, but each interception cost fuel that could not be replaced. Every liter of aviation fuel now came from oil fields that lay thousands of miles away, carried by tankers that traveled through waters infested with submarines. Losses averaged 6 ships a month, and the reserves that fed the fleet's tanks were down to a handful of weeks. The numbers told their own story. The empire could not sustain another Guadalcanal. In March, the sea told the story again in fire. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea unfolded before Ugaki's eyes as the Japanese tried to send 8 transports and their escorts to reinforce Leh. American bombers found them. For 2 days, waves of B-17s and Australian Beaufighters tore the convoy apart. Every ship was sunk. More than 3,000 soldiers drowned or burned in the water. Ugaki stood in the operations room at Rabaul, listening to the radio intercepts and watching pins move across the map until they simply stopped. He had witnessed defeat before, but never such annihilation. The sea was ours once, he wrote in his diary that night. Now it belongs to the enemy's planes. The phrase was simple, but it marked a turning point in his own understanding. The Imperial Navy had been built for ship-to-ship combat, for the decisive battle dreamed of since Tsushima. Yet the new war belonged to the air. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the sea. The Americans had proved that at Midway and proved it again at the Bismarck Sea. Ugaki's staff tried to find comfort in the courage of the men who fought. But courage could not change mathematics. Japan's aircraft losses in March alone exceeded the total number built that month. Pilots died faster than they could be trained. The new recruits arriving at Rabaul had barely 60 hours of flight time. Many crashed on their first missions. The veteran instructors were dead or exhausted, their faces hollow from sleeplessness and malnutrition. By summer, the shadow of defeat stretched northward. Allied bombers came daily, sometimes twice a day. Ugaki watched as the once proud base at Rabaul turned into a cratered skeleton of concrete and twisted metal. Each raid left new wrecks burning in the harbor. The heavy cruisers that had survived Midway and Guadalcanal were now anchored permanently, out of fuel or crippled by near misses. The air was thick with smoke and the sour smell of burnt aviation fuel. Ugaki's quarters shook so often that the windows had to be removed to keep them from shattering. He still wrote in his diary every night, sometimes by candlelight during blackouts. Every raid is like a hammer against the bones of the fleet, he wrote in June. We no longer count victories, only what remains to lose. His handwriting had become smaller, more precise, like the voice of a man trying to preserve control when everything else was collapsing. The broader world confirmed what he already knew. In Europe, the German armies were retreating from Stalingrad. In Africa, the Allies had landed in Tunisia. The global tide of war had turned against the Axis on every front. Yet the orders from Tokyo remained the same: hold, defend, delay. Ugaki obeyed because duty demanded it, but each order felt like adding sand to a tide wall that was already washing away. He sometimes walked at night along the edge of the ruined airfield, staring at the stars reflected in the oil-slicked puddles, wondering how long the fleet could pretend to fight. When a young officer once asked him if Japan could still win, he answered softly, "Victory was a moment. We are living in what follows." September 30th, 1943. Truk Lagoon. The tropical air was heavy with humidity and the slow smell of rust that came from ships idle too long. Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome stood again on the deck of the Yamato, her steel decks fading to a pale gray under the relentless sun. It had been almost a year since Guadalcanal, yet nothing had replaced what had been lost. Japan's fleet still looked powerful on paper. 11 battleships, 9 carriers, dozens of cruisers, but most of them could not move. They lay at anchor like monuments, beautiful but paralyzed. Fuel shortages had become catastrophic. The Navy Ministry had calculated that at current consumption rates, the Imperial fleet could conduct one major operation before exhausting its entire reserve of heavy fuel oil. Ugaki knew the figure by heart. Less than 300,000 tons remained. The Americans, by comparison, were burning 5 million tons a month. Every transport that left Balikpapan risked submarine attack. Half never arrived. He had spent the past weeks coordinating convoys, assigning destroyers as escorts that should have been guarding carriers. It felt like carving flesh from one limb to bandage another. From the deck, he could see the lagoon dotted with the silhouettes of cruisers and carriers, but most were out of service. Maintenance crews worked without spare parts. Corrosion spread through electrical wiring. The great arsenal of Japan had become a floating museum of exhaustion. The wider war pressed closer with every passing month. In the Solomons, the Americans had seized New Georgia and were landing on Bougainville. To the north, they struck the Gilberts and Marshalls. The perimeter Japan had once believed unbreakable was being peeled away one island at a time. Ugaki read the intercepts that passed through the intelligence office. American carriers struck Tarawa, Makin, and Kwajalein with precision that astonished him. They seemed to appear everywhere at once. He understood why when he saw a report on American shipbuilding. In 1943 alone, the United States had completed more than 65,000 aircraft and over 1,000 naval vessels, including new Essex-class carriers. Japanese production in the same year had fallen. Factories in Osaka and Yokosuka were running on reduced electricity as coal shipments dwindled. Steel output had dropped by nearly 40% since 1941. He could see the consequences in every message from the front. Aircraft flying without armor plates to save weight, destroyers launched without sonar, and new ships that arrived without proper fire control. When he wrote in his diary that night, he did not bother with rhetoric. "We cannot replace what we lose," he wrote. "The enemy grows larger with every hour." In October, Ugaki traveled to Saipan to inspect air defenses. The island was bustling with new construction, airfields, fuel depots, and submarine pens. But even there, the signs of strain were everywhere. The garrison lacked heavy equipment, and the anti-aircraft batteries had ammunition for only a few minutes of sustained firing. The pilots stationed there, most barely 20, greeted him with nervous smiles. They were brave but untested. He dined with their commander, who admitted that replacements arrived without night flight training. "We will teach them in combat," the officer said. Ugaki nodded, but felt a tightening in his chest. He had once believed that Japan's spiritual strength could compensate for material weakness. Now he saw the limits of that faith. Spirit did not replace fuel. Courage did not refill supply ships. On the flight back, to Truk, he looked down at the Pacific, a vast mirror stretching to the horizon, and thought of how that very expanse had once protected Japan. It now served as the enemy's highway. From one end of it to the other, American ships moved under cover of naval air power, while Japanese convoys scurried at night like hunted animals. When Ugaki landed, he was told that another tanker had been sunk off Palau. The crew was lost. The Navy's fuel pool had fallen below 2 months' supply. The mechanics at Truk were draining aviation gas from grounded planes just to keep the patrols flying. Every engine that started was a small victory against arithmetic. That winter, the raids on Truk began. In February 1944, Operation Hailstone brought the war to the doorstep of what had once been Japan's mightiest forward base. For 2 days, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 pounded the lagoon. Ugaki watched from a hillside bunker as the sky filled with fire. He could see Yamato's massive guns firing at phantom targets high above, the thunder echoing across the lagoon. Columns of smoke rose from burning ships, cruisers, transports, oilers. By evening, the horizon glowed red. When the raid ended, more than 40 ships were sunk or burning. The lagoon that had once represented Japan's power now looked like a graveyard. Ugaki walked the shoreline the next morning, stepping over debris, smelling the acrid sweetness of burned oil. A damaged Zero lay half buried in the sand, its wings torn and riddled with holes. The pilot's body was gone. Only his flight scarf remained, twisted around a fragment of metal. Ugaki bent to pick it up and held it in his hands. "We believed the Pacific would protect us," he murmured. "Now, it betrays us." The base commander approached with casualty figures. Over 3,000 men were dead or missing. Most of the fuel reserve for the Central Pacific Fleet was gone. The staff officers who had survived were silent, their faces pale under soot. The fleet had not sailed a mile in months, and now it could not. The official communiqué sent to Tokyo called the losses serious but not decisive. Ugaki wrote his own version that night in his private log, one that no censor would ever see. "Truk is finished," he wrote. "The enemy now holds the skies and the seas. Our ships rot where they anchor. Our planes fall faster than they can climb. The Empire's reach has been broken." He knew that the Americans would move next toward the Marianas. He could already see the shape of it in the enemy's pattern. Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Iwetok. Each strike closer than the last. Each supported by logistics that Japan could not imagine replicating. He thought of the young men training on Saipan and wondered how many weeks they had left. The war, once a bold offensive across half the world, had become a siege fought in retreat. As he extinguished the lamp in his quarters, Ugaki heard the faint groan of the wind against the shattered hangars. The Pacific night was vast and silent. Somewhere far beyond that darkness, the American fleet was gathering again, invisible but inevitable. He closed his diary and wrote a final line before sleep took him. "The Empire still fights, but the Admirals already know. We have seen the end with our own eyes.